Good afternoon, everyone. As you can see from the title, we've saved the absolute best session for the end of the day. And as you can also guess, we're going to be talking about some very lighthearted and fluffy things. But what I'm going to be talking about and drawing from mostly in the next 18 minutes is collectively lots of the work that the Prisons Research Center has done over the years, including quite a lot of quality of life studies and quite a lot from Alison Liebling and her work specifically on prison officers. But first, I'm going to start with two interrelated stories. So during a recent period of field work, I was having a chat with a prisoner and one of his personal officers about power in the prison, where it lies and how it flows, and they were both expressing some frustration with the prison's bureaucracy. The prisoner was lamenting about the processes he had to go through in order to get Sensodyne toothpaste for his sensitive gums. It entailed several applications, an appointment with the nurse, a doctor, a referral to the dentist, a prescription, and in total took several weeks to accomplish. The prisoner was praising this officer, saying, "I could never get anything done without his help." The officer, and he joked about where power was held in the prison, the officer saying it was above his head and all I can do is make phone calls and try to get someone to follow through. The prisoner, however, disagreed with this by remarking, part of that may be true, he can't make appointments or guarantee that anyone else does his job. He then turned to the officer and said, "But you do have power. You have the power to help or hinder, and that makes all the difference. You advocated for me, you didn't have to do that, but you did." And a few weeks after this conversation, I was at the pub with a prison officer friend recounting this story, and I, in part, used it as an example of one of the many ways I personally would make a very bad prison officer, as I would have probably just smuggled in the toothpaste for the prisoner out of pity or with some bureaucratic resistance. And then I rather brazenly asked my friend if he had ever brought anything in for a prisoner, and he said yes once, and then explained. A prisoner in his unit was a few weeks away from being released, and he had all the normal anxieties, family stuff, employment, money, but he was most acutely concerned with having to walk the 1.5 miles from the prison to his home with the prison-issued standard plastic bag. The bag which is easily identifiable and doesn't have handles, and which for him made that experience more humiliating. So every day up until his release, he asked this officer to bring him in a plastic Asda bag with handles so that he could look normal walking through the streets of his town. And my friend knew that if he went through official security channels with this request, it would be denied, or that he'd be viewed as vulnerable for being corrupted. It was also, of course, against the rules. But he made the decision quite early on to bring one in, even after one of his colleagues warned him that it all starts with an Asda bag, the next request won't be so minor. The prisoner, when presented with the bag on his day of his release, was beside himself and thanked the officer for being human. And as an outsider and not an officer, I found this story to be a beautiful example of good discretion. But I recognize that that might be slightly controversial to say, and you will all no doubt have your own interpretation and response to this example. But this is in part the aim of this session and our next discussion group, is to reflect and think about these issues. And you may not always have the time to talk with each other or reflect on the ways that you use your power or discretion. And the work you do is complex, deeply relational, highly discretionary, and you're continuously faced with making tough, moral, and practical decisions. And as many of the speakers today have already discussed, being a prison officer requires a sophisticated set of skills, which are often underappreciated and overlooked. Officers often find it difficult to articulate or describe their craft, why they made the decisions they did in that moment, or how they best diffused a situation. And this is also true for the ways in which you deploy or exercise your power and authority, and how these flow through relationships. And Alison's extensive research on prison officers highlights the importance of relationships for maintaining order, peacekeeping and negotiating, for reducing suicides, increasing well-being, and, as you will hear more about tomorrow, triggering transformational change in prisoners. Wielding power and authority in good and positive ways, trusting your instincts, and using intelligent discretion are all part of the complex skills and the jailcraft that you've developed. And I began with those two stories for several reasons, but primarily to emphasize the ways in which you use your power and discretion affects those in your care. And for the two prisoners in these stories, their lives were positively impacted by the good work done by officers. They felt recognized. And the power to help or hinder is massive. Jeff Mulgan, in writing about good and bad power in governments, remarks that all that we know from social science confirms that people are deeply aware of their relative position. They suffer without recognition and thrive with it. And when officers are at their best, prisoners describe feeling respected, human, and valued as an individual, and power flows in all the right ways. Finding the balance between welfare and discipline or care and power is difficult and never static, but you often accomplish this, and often repeatedly, throughout a day's work. And as Allison indicated earlier, it's very easy to see and feel when authority is misused or abused, but it's far more challenging to understand and document and appreciate the nuance of when authority is used well and intelligently. The work and role of prison officers has changed radically in the last several decades, and a lot of these themes have already been coming up. And prisons and the prisoner population have also changed massively over the last several decades. Some power has shifted outwards off the wings to specialized areas. There are fewer of you now, there's less time, and many officers tell us they feel de-skilled or deprofessionalized. However, officers remain figures of power with the authority to control the flow of power in both positive and negative ways. In Allison's book, The Prison Officer, she notes that authority is not a thing, but an interpretive process, something that is continually sought, interrupted, disrupted, and sought again. There are a number of variables that affect how power is mobilized and how intelligent authority is used, some of which are listed here. And as Ben discussed, we know that some prison cultures are heavier, more traditional or cynical, and may rely on oppressive methods for compliance, whilst other establishments are lighter, sometimes permissive, and authority can be underused. And we also know from our research that age and experience in officers matters. Younger and less experienced officers, those who haven't fully developed their jailcraft, are often quick to overuse their authority through sanctions or segregation, rather than a more dynamic or relational. And we're also keenly aware that a prison's management and leadership and the moral tone they set and the support they provide for officers, which again has already been mentioned, significantly impacts officers' perceptions of their safety and security, their job satisfaction, orientations towards prisoners, and the way in which officers are able to deliver a humane and constructive regime. And all of these things do matter and have serious implications for prisoners and their outcomes, as well as staff well-being. So how do you find the right place between care and power, trusting enough but not too much, being authoritative without being authoritarian, demonstrating fairness without being too rigid or relaxed? Earlier, Allison alluded to the differences between good and right relationships between staff and prisoners. She describes right relationships as sitting somewhere between formality and informality, closeness and distance, policing by consent and imposing order. Indeed, it is all about balance, trusting your instincts, knowing your prisoners, and having professional confidence and competence. And this is no easy feat, especially when time feels elusive. But when authority is delivered well and intelligently, it's often invisible work. And an officer recently described this to me as ghost work. 30 years ago, an academic named John Hepburn set out to understand how prison guards in the US regard their own power and to gain insight into what kinds of power guards believed were most important in securing compliance and order. And he asked the officers in his sample to rank these 5 statements according to its importance as a reason why prisoners do what you want them to do. And each of these corresponds to what Hepburn calls the 5 bases of power, which we will go through next. And you'll be quick to recognize that in any given situation or interaction, these can be overlapping, differently mobilized, or dependent on the relationship between the officer and prisoner. Authority is not finite or fixed. We describe it as dynamic. Good officers will mobilize several bases of power without even knowing it, and this is part of your craft. When trying to gain compliance, you often, within an instant, have to make serious assessments by reading a situation, using dialogue, rapport, appreciating the context and circumstances, all while ensuring the safety and security of those around you. Maintaining good, boundaried, and healthy relationships with prisoners requires flexibility, but also consistency and appropriate and legitimate authority. And I'm very mindful of the time, and I'm running out very, very quickly, but I'll do my best to fit as much in, Simon. So the first one of Hepburn's power bases was legitimate power. So what I might do is just highlight a few of the powers instead of all 5 of them. But the first power was legitimate, and his conception of legitimacy is a little too narrow and legalistic. More contemporary thinkers, like our colleagues Tony Bottoms and Justice Tankibi in our institute, expand on this by defining legitimacy as authority used rightfully or power exercised in accordance with established rules and values. In other words, legitimacy is the recognition of the right to govern. Prisoners are unlikely to obey and comply simply because someone in a uniform tells them to do so, as this prisoner comments. And Allison's research suggests that when power is accepted as more rather than less legitimate, certain things will follow. Obedience is more likely to be enduring rather than grudging. Information will flow more readily between the power holders and their subjects. Trust will develop, and well-being will be higher. Prisoners find officers more legitimate when they exercise fairness, consistency, and professionalism, and wield their authority in responsible ways. And the second base of power was coercive power, which is potentially one of the most important ones. Evidence has demonstrated that prisoners do not comply with directions on a routine basis when officers regularly exercise coercive power. It is not a sustainable or legitimate form of power. It often incites anger and alienation in prisoners and can often increase levels of distress and violence. Coercive power is most effective when it is always available, but only rarely used. And again, Allison's research on incentives and earned privileges, which was mentioned earlier, concluded that there is empirical support for the relationship between legitimacy and compliance. That prisoners who feel treated unfairly quite quickly become defiant and resentful and view regimes as illegitimate. And prisoners are astutely aware of how officers use their power. When officers are quick to use force or overly reliant on IEP, prisoners perceive this as desperation. They have no other choice. They don't know what else to do. And this has serious implications for maintaining order and stability. I'm going to skip this one. So we're going to move to expert power. In Hepburn's study, expert power was related to technical expertise, often found in treatment-oriented units or establishments. However, we would conceive of expertise more in terms of experience and know-how, essentially jailcraft, rather than just technical proficiency. And as the prisoner here points out, an officer on his wing was viewed as having expert knowledge because of his length of time in the job and his understanding of the need of lifers. Prisoners often seek out officers who exert professional competence and confidence, those who have answers or those who will get answers, those who know about the things that matter most to them in their day-to-day lives, and also in a broader custodial sense. And Hepburn notes that expert power can be undermined by bureaucratic administrative processes. that the routinization of tasks and the centralization of decision-making can threaten the professional autonomy of prison officers. And when given less latitude, officers have fewer opportunities to demonstrate or use their expertise. I'm wondering if any of this sounds familiar to you. Despite this, however, as the prisoner noted in my first story about his toothpaste, although some decisions may be made elsewhere in the prison, power still flows through officers who most certainly have the ability to help or hinder with their experience and expertise. And the final base of power is referent power. In some ways, this is the most important form of power, as it is the basis for right relationships and will determine the ways in which officers mobilize other forms of power alongside it. Many of these characteristics have already been talked about when referring to officers as at their best. More experienced officers view their power as derived from the manner of working with prisoners. Prisoners are more compliant when they respect the conduct of the officer, which also links back to viewing them as having legitimate authority. And one of the findings from Hepburn's study indicated that more experienced officers tend to rely on what approximates to a combination of expert and referent power. So to conclude in my 1 minute, relationships are at the heart of every prison, but the challenge is getting these relationships right. Being a good prison officer involves being good at not using force, but still getting things done, and being prepared to use the various power bases available when necessary. And it is about harmonizing welfare and discipline and being dynamic in the use of authority. And fundamentally, it is about dialogue. And someone, I think from Liverpool, said it earlier during the fireside chat, it is all about talk and having the time to talk. So although certain forms of power have shifted, prison officers still have the power. And as Allison talked about earlier, officers have the moral power of regard and recognition. So in your discussion groups, I'm hoping you can reflect on some of these things and potentially try to articulate the ways that you think about power, regard your own power, and how you deploy it. How do we learn from those mistakes when power or authority has gone wrong, or when the outcome has been very positive? And how do you find the right balance of power and authority? And what does that look and feel like to you? And what does that look and feel like to prisoners? Thank you.